So welcome to Masterpiece. It was a great pleasure to be asked to do this highlight tour virtually from home this afternoon for the Masterpiece 2020. And I've chosen five of my favorite highlights from this year's exhibition, Masterpiece exhibition, really spanning 300 years. And I've started with a lovely paste suite of jewellery from the 18th century, from about 1760. And a really fabulous piece that survived in its entirety, but has the necklace, wonderful girandole earrings, and the aigrette as well. And I've always liked to show these wonderful jewels really in context. So I've got a fashion plate from the 18th century, which you can really sort of see how they would have been worn, and obviously the fashion plate with this rather elaborate, rather eccentric wig that were very high fashion in the 18th century, just to give you an idea of how they would have been worn at the time. And what's interesting about paste at this time, whereas today we think of paste as a sort of inexpensive alternative, this was not the case in the 18th century. Paste was innovative, it was new, it was modern, and particularly with coloured paste, which is extremely rare, you could achieve a uniformity of colour and the cutting of the paste that you could not achieve with natural stones. Another thing which is interesting is obviously the setting. Now, if you think that paste is quite soft, it's very hard to set paste. So invariably, when you see these pieces surviving from the 18th century, the way the paste is set is actually far superior to the way diamonds or gemstones would have been set, because the skill is much more, greater skill is normally needed. And if you look at this piece, what is lovely is it's still got the original loops at the back. Obviously, in the 18th century, you didn't have the conventional clip fastenings that you have today with necklaces. They would always be attached with loops that would be attached by ribbons at the back of the neck. If we could have the next slide, please. This one, again, I'm sort of putting it into context. And I think if you're looking at the 18th century, you really have to mention Horace Walpole, that great commentator, man of letters of the 18th century. And he comments on everything, but he also comments on jewelry at the time. And couple of my favorite quotes was one on Lady Harrington attending the coronation of George III in 1761. And he says of her that she was covered with all the diamonds she could borrow, hire, or seize. Of Lady Elizabeth, Duchess of Northumberland, he said she was stifled with diamonds. And I think this really just conjures up this wonderful picture of excess. 18th century England, and particularly London, was a bit like 19th century New York. It was a city, a cosmopolitan city, a growing middle class, huge fortunes were being won and lost, and obviously new money was becoming old money very quickly. And Walpole himself was essentially new money. His mother was the daughter of a Baltic timber merchant. So he was actually propelling himself into the aristocracy in the 18th century. And again, I've shown it here with some fashion, another fashion plate, ladies' fashion, gentlemen's fashion, and children's fashion from the 18th century. So you can just see you can imagine something like this paste parure being worn on these wonderful Spitalfield silk, but obviously in candlelight. So the effect must have been absolutely dazzling in the 18th century. On the left, the smaller caption just shows some jewelry designs from the 18th century. One is actually an aigrette, so it gives you an idea of these very elaborate head ornaments that would have been affixed to these very large wigs that were very fashionable in the 18th century. So it just gives you an idea of sort of putting everything into context. And if we can go, Nathan, if we can just go back to the previous slide, slide one again, just to sort of focus on the parure. I just want to look at one more of that. One thing I'd point out is these wonderful girandole earrings, and obviously in the 18th century, it's all about height. So you have these wonderful wigs, and obviously the neck and the face would be framed by these very large, actually quite heavy girandole earrings that were very fashionable at the time. So they would frame the face and they would frame the neck of the wearer, and obviously give that much more essence of height. If we can go on to the slide 3. So just jump ahead, that's it. So I'm now jumping ahead right to London and the swinging 60s, the 1960s, early 70s. And I've chosen this piece by Grima being exhibited by the Grima Gallery. And what I love about this, it's just so modern, so innovative. It's everything that is new, modern, on point, and actually just as modern today as it would have been in the 1960s. The actual gem itself, the aquamarine, is rather unusual. It's called a fantasy cut. And the German lapidary was Bernhard Mustainer, and he was actually trained in Pforzheim in Germany. And he created this rather elaborate way of cutting the gemstones, which was very unconventional, almost slicing away sections of the gemstones from the back. And this is just so unconventional, so modern. And even the setting with these sort of arrows of diamonds. Grima is an interesting designer. He was born in Rome, brought up in England, and actually he studied mechanical engineering at the University of Nottingham. So not the normal route into jewelry design, slightly different route. Two brothers that were architects. So very, very sort of eclectic background and approach into jewelry. If we could have the next slide, Nathan. And the next slide, I like to show pictures of the designers where I can find them. So there is Andrew Grima at his sort of design board, very much like an architect. And I found a slide of his gallery in Jermyn Street, which is incredibly famous at the day. This sort of 60s brutalism with these sort of bronze metal plaques. And there were little windows that were cut out where you could actually glimpse the jewels through the windows. And it was designed partly by his two architect brothers. They had a sort of hand in designing the gallery. It also had the first perspex spiral staircase in the world, apparently. So it was very much modernity, very new, very fresh. And as a result, he attracted a lot of the sort of the great and the good of the day. Queen Elizabeth, Princess Margaret, Barbara Hepworth, Jacqueline Onassis, Jacqueline Kennedy, were all clients of Andrew Grima in the 1960s. But it really is a wonderful, wonderful piece. If we just go back, Nathan, to the aquamarine again, and just really sort of typical of the 1960s. Wonderful, wonderful example. If I can whiz through to slide 3, so just jump ahead to slide 3. So for the third choice, I've gone to the 1920s. It's one of my colleagues that know me. I absolutely adore the 1920s. It's definitely a period I would love to have had the chance to visit. And it really is, again, innovative, modern, it's fresh. It's all about lots of excessive ornament, good design, and strong colors. And this wonderful bandeau, it's a tiara, but it's reimagined. And that's why I've shown it against a fashion plate or a photograph of 4 very glamorous 1920s flappers to give you an idea of the fashion of the period and how these jewels would have been worn. Hair was cut short, skirts were hiked up. This really epitomizes the jazz age. So it's this age of the Great Gatsby. And the color, it was all about bold colors, which you wouldn't have seen so much in sort of high jewelry in earlier periods. So orange and black, very Art Deco colors, but you also had red and black, white and black, blue and green. So it was all about very strong contrasting primary colors. No pastel colors, always very, very strong colors. And what is wonderful, what I love about this piece is it's so wearable today, just as much as it was in the 1920s, and the effect that you could have by wearing something like a tiara like this. Same effect, probably even a greater effect than if you were wearing a simple diamond necklace. This is something that's really a statement piece. Post-lockdown, if we ever get the chance to go back to the opera, go back to the theatre, dinner parties, this is the sort of thing that was really sort of a statement piece. And so just as fashionable today as it would have been in the 1920s. 20s is a fashionable, very interesting period to sort of look into. What we now know as Art Deco was sort of evolving very much before the First World War, but it really did arrive in 1925 with the Paris International Exhibition, which really launched Art Deco. And it draws its inspiration from a variety of influences: Cubism, Italian Futurism, Soviet brutalism, and one loose term I say Orientalism, but that can incorporate the Far East, China, India, Persia, Egypt, Mexico, South America. You name it, it drew from every other culture, past historical and ancient cultures, for its inspiration. But generally there is bold colors and there's a strong sort of geometric influence in Art Deco. If I could have Nathan, the next slide, please. And I put these two slides because they show the Paris 1925 exposition, the International Exhibition of Modern and Industrial and Decorative Arts. Very important exhibition, ran for 7 months, but it really did launch Art Deco. Sadly, all the photographs of this period, they're all black and white, so you just can't get an idea of the color. But there is this sort of rather grainy shot of the Eiffel Tower that actually wasn't in the exhibition grounds, but it was illuminated by Citroën in these wonderful orange, yellow, and black colors. So this is pure Deco. And This is why I would love to go back to 1925 and visit the exhibition, because it was in color. It's glorious color, which you just can't see today with the black and white grainy shots. And again, the poster, which again, orange, that sort of reddish orange and black, so sort of popular, very, very fashionable colors of the Art Deco period. And you can sort of see the influence, the Art Deco inspiration in the poster. So very, very modern, very, very forward thinking of that period, and a sort of style that really lasted up until just before the Second World War. I mean, it started, I would say, from 1919 and really finished on the sort of the eve of the Second World War, right up until 1939, but very much in two phases. The sort of much more colourful, lots of strong colour in the sort of 1920s, and then it became more sort of monochromatic in the 1930s. Essentially a 20-year period. If Nathan, we could have the next slide, please. Thank you. And again, I've sort of still in the early 20th century, but I've jumped pre-war now, and I've chosen a piece by Louis Comfort Tiffany, son of Charles Tiffany, who was the founder of Tiffany in New York. And I've shown a slide of the showroom, the galleries in New York, because Tiffany was very much a bit like Liberty as a department store in that period, in that sort of pre-First World War period. You could buy everything in Tiffany. It's only more recently we think of Tiffany very much as a jeweler, but in that period in the early 20th century, you could furnish your house from Tiffany. Louis Comfort Tiffany, he's famous for his Tiffany lamps, and you can see some of his lamps there in that slide on the left, and working with glass. He wasn't actually a trained jeweler or a goldsmith, but he was interested by nature, and he really does embrace what we would say is the arts and crafts movement. And I would say the particularly American arts and crafts, but the arts and crafts movement was global. In England, we know it as the arts and crafts movement. In Italy, it was actually called Style Liberty. Wienerwerkstatt in Austria, Jugendstil in Germany, but there were versions of the arts and crafts in Russia, in Scandinavia. So it was a global phenomena. In France, I would probably say it was more influenced by the Art Nouveau, but it was a global movement. And he really did embrace this. And what his approach to it was really looking not so much at it as intrinsic value, but the design. So he is, again, a true goldsmith, influenced by nature, pastel colors in the stones. And particularly with this necklace, you can see these sort of wonderful sort of pale colored sapphires, which are almost certainly Montana sapphires. And he really did champion the use of a sort of local American gemstones. So we have sapphires from Montana, tourmalines from Maine, and freshwater pearls from the Mississippi River. And again, this is very much in the ethos of the arts and crafts movement. You're going back to nature. You're using local, as much as you can, local materials, and obviously gold from the American gold rush at the time. So it's a wonderful example and a caption, a sort of snapshot of that period, the early 20th century. And again, particularly with American arts and crafts, a bit like English arts and crafts, the style continued into the 20s. So it wasn't the case that the First World War finished the arts and crafts interest. It did actually continue. It more finished, I would say, probably in continental Europe, sort of France, Italy, moved away from it. But in America and England, the style did sort of continue into the early 1920s. Nathan, if I can have the next slide, please. And again, I found a nice shot of Louis Comfort Tiffany. So you can see the man behind the designs, behind the jewels, and then again a photograph of the galleries in New York. So you can see some of his Tiffany lamps. And to give you an idea, it was a bit like a department store, a very glamorous department store, a little bit like Liberty's, where you could go and furnish your entire house from Tiffany, windows, lamps, furniture, everything, and you could even wear the wonderful Tiffany jewels. Nathan, if I could have my next slide, please. So I've chosen these earrings by Van Cleef & Arpels because I feel it's one of their most sort of famous, iconic styles, one of their iconic techniques. These wonderful clips invisibly set. They actually applied for the patent as early as 1933. And interestingly, they weren't the first jeweler to actually use this invisibly setting, but they are the only jeweler that really made it a house style. And they continued with this style even to the present day. So it really is an amazing and ingenious and inventive technique. I found this wonderful slide of an advert for Van Cleef, and it actually shows their premises in Paris, but the whole facade is invisibly set. So it really just shows you how much a sort of house style, how much it is an icon of Van Cleef. If we could have the next slide, please. And here it sort of gives you an idea of what is actually involved. It's really is incredibly labor intensive, and the skill really is exceptional, is what is actually employed to create these wonderful jewels. Firstly, they'll have to choose the stones and match them for color. Then they have to cut the stones, and then they have to cut these tiny little grooves in the side of each stone, and then they are slid onto these wonderful little sort of tram lines, the best of describing it, into each setting. Now, the image on the left really shows it as sort of a basic grid, but if you have to imagine this, that if you're creating a floral brooch or something like the floral clips, then the surface isn't flat, it's undulating, and then it might go to a point with a petal. So every stone is custom made and custom cut to fit that setting. And of course, if you chip a stone, which is perfectly possible when you're doing the cutting these stones, then you have to start again. So very, very labor intensive. A lot of man hours are used to actually create these really wonderful pieces. And then once they're set, the metal is completely hidden. So you don't see any of the metal at all, completely concealed. And again, on the right, it's another a sort of sketch showing how the actual design works and how these pieces are constructed. It really is a sort of an amazing example of inventiveness and engineering, actually, as well, combined with a great jewelry design. If we can have the next slide, please. And I've chosen this piece by Eliane Fatal, a contemporary jewelry designer that reimagines other sort of antique pieces or vintage pieces. She'll take something that maybe Edwardian or Victorian and reimagine it, repurpose it into a modern jewel, which is very much a unique piece. What she's done here with this wonderful necklace, she's taken a butterfly brooch, Victorian butterfly brooch, and the Victorians loved their insect brooches and their butterflies and dragonflies and beetles and flies and bees. But she's reimagined it. So conventionally, it would have been worn probably in the hair. And I always like to show a fashion slide on sort of to juxtapose it, so you can sort of put it into the original context of how it would have been worn. So possibly in the hair, maybe as a brooch pinned to the bodice. But she's reimagined it. So she's turned this brooch into this wonderful, almost like the sort of flight. And she's got this wonderful, almost like a phoenix actually, with this wonderful sort of trail of feathers and wings and petals coming out of the butterfly. So it really is a nice sort of way of reimagining a piece of Victorian jewelry into a very sort of modern purpose. And actually, she does a lot of transformable jewels as well. So very sort of where they can have multi-uses. So you can wear them not just as a necklace, but you can wear them in the hair, or you could even wear it, I suppose, as a brooch. If I could have the next slide, please. And the next slide is really just a bit of fun. It's just sort of put Victorians into context. This was actually by Lily Sambourne, the famous sort of Punch drawer, cartoonist, and he's really just showing the Victorian fascination with insects, which is rather fun. And they loved their insects, they loved their butterflies, and I think butterflies are probably one of the nicest of the Victorian fascinations for insects, sort of symbol of the soul. And this is just really sort of just looking at the sort of the amusing side of it, but it's rather fun. And these days from about the 1870s, the late 1870s, but it just shows you how much the Victorians loved their flowers, their flora and fauna. So they love their flowers and they love their insects as well. And if we could just go back to the previous slide, please, sort of end on the necklace. And you can just sort of see, you can imagine how the Victorians would have worn it, but obviously reimagined into a piece of contemporary jewelry that you can wear today. It's so wearable, so modern, but also so a nice sort of acknowledgement of the past, but also really embracing modernity as well. And if we could have the next slide, please. And my final slide, I've chosen an Italian jeweler, Alfredo Ravasco. He was the son of a Genovese goldsmith, Giacomo Ravasco. And the father was interesting because he embraced the style liberty, so Italian arts and crafts. So he comes from a family of very innovative, forward-thinking, modernistic jewelers of that period. But Alfredo really did embrace the arts and crafts, the Art Deco movement of that time. Joined the firm in 1922, and he exhibited a lot of the international fairs. The most famous one is the one of the 1925 Paris exposition, but obviously New York in 1928, Athens in 1931, and his clients are kind of quite a sort of the great and the good of that period. So the Vatican, the House of Savoy, and interestingly with Alfredo's designs, they are Art Deco with a twist. I think they are a different take on the Art Deco style. And you might see a little influence of nature. And he's normally known for objects, photo frames, boxes, bowls, wonderful sort of creations in hard stone, sometimes with a sort of nautical or a marine theme. And I've sort of shown, I've found another very old photograph of a jewelry design, but you've got that sort of mixture of sort of nature mixed in with the Art Deco. So his jewels actually are extremely rare. I mean, his output is extremely rare anyway, but the jewels are even more scarce. If we can go to the last slide, Nathan, please. And again, I've a sort of screenshot of the city of the Paris exposition of 1925, and this really shows the whole exhibition. It was a vast exhibition. It's about 72 acres, and it's right in the centre of Paris. So you can imagine it took over the whole of Paris in glorious Technicolor. And the sort of fashion plate at the side, the reason I put this here is really, again, to put these jewels into perspective, because in the 1920s, you had a much more linear style. And by having this photograph of the flapper here with a very short hair wound up with a sort of a scarf at the top, you can imagine these earrings being worn, again, accentuating the neck. So again, not that dissimilar from the first slide where we were looking at the 18th century. Again, it's about the sort of linear shape of the female form, very straight form, and a very sort of high neck and very short hair. So it takes in, I think I love this slide actually because she's smoking, which obviously is very taboo today, but it just shows, put everything into the concept. This is very much forward thinking, a flapper who could go to these speakeasies and these jazz clubs unchaperoned in the 1920s. So it's very much a forward thinking, it's very much a new decade. And I think it sort of typifies the jewels of that period. That is the last slide. So if there's any questions, I did see a couple popping up at the bottom if you want to ask me, and I'll endeavour, do my best to sort of ask those questions. And
hi Justin, it's Laura. So we've got a couple of questions. One of them is, where did the majority of diamonds originate from during the Georgian period?
Well, there's always a mistaken belief that the diamonds come from India and the Golconda mines, which historically is true. But once you get to the 18th century, the diamond output of the Indian mines is quite poor. They've very much been sort of robbed out. And really the diamonds at that point, from about the 1720s onwards, are from Brazil. And we actually there's a whole region in Brazil where you get these wonderful gems, and not just diamonds, lots of other gemstones as well. Emeralds and amethysts, all coming from this area, but particularly diamonds. And it's interesting because the sort of the snobbery of the 18th century was that if your diamonds weren't from India, they weren't really that good. So the rather canny Portuguese traders was ship their diamonds from Brazil, ship them over to India, and then trade them out of India back to Europe. So they did a sort of this like sort of literally going around the world to get back to Europe. And so I would say the majority, really up until the discovery of diamonds in South Africa in the latter part of the 19th century, are from Brazil. Probably a very small quantity from India, but the majority at this time are from Brazil.
Thank you. And the next question is, what do Montana sapphires look like, and where are the mines located?
If I do from where they're located, so geography is not my great point, but if you imagine a map of North America on your screen, and if you picture Canada at the top and Seattle sort of bottom left, move over to the right, and that's where Montana is, and sort of in the middle of Montana, so just next to Washington State, so sort of top left of the United States. And quite a sort of, I think, quite a mountainous region as well. And I think there is even a village there called Sapphire Village. And in terms of what the sapphires look like, I would probably say, to try and picture them, it's always difficult describing color just verbally, but if you imagine a cornflower blue sapphire from Ceylon, but slightly more electric is the only way I can probably best way of describing it. They are very distinctive in terms of their colour, but there was wonderful sort of cornflower blue, but a much more livelier cornflower blue than you will see in a typical salon stone.
Thank you. And then another question. You have picked historic pieces. Do you have any contemporary highlights, or do you think pieces need to stand the test of time?
Ah, that's an interesting question. There are actually, I mean, I would say there are some very good, I mean, one of the modern contemporary jewelers that I absolutely love is Hemmerle. I think their approach to looking at their past, that they were obviously traditionally, historically produced medals, and the way they've looked in their archives and reinterpreted that in a very modern way, and sometimes using older materials, whether it's cameos or Egyptian artifacts that they will incorporate into their modern jewels. But I think Hemmerle pieces are truly wonderful. It's one of my favorite contemporary jewelers that you will see today. Another sort of contemporary jeweler I love is Buccellati as well. I think some of the Buccellati pieces, one of my favorite Italian goldsmiths. So they're sort of two that I, in terms of contemporary jewelers, that I love. But I would say I really am a fan of Hemmerle. And there was another part of that question, wasn't it? Can you repeat that, Laura? The other part.
Do you think jewelry needs to stand the test of time?
Well, I would say the main thing about jewelry, it's to be worn. It was designed to be worn, and you've got to be able to wear it. So as long as you can wear it, yes, it will stand the test of time. I would say most of the older pieces that are still around today have stood the test of time. It's not bad jewelry that survives. Good jewelry does survive. So it's already stood 200, 300 years, 100 years of history. But the main thing is it's there to be worn. And I think it's, in a lot of the cases, it's us. I mean, we really need to, as the ladies out there wearing jewelry, we need to, wear the jewels and wear them in a different way. I mean, one of the mantras that you keep being repeated is the brooch is back. And I think, yes, it is back, but please don't wear it on the lapel of a jacket. Why not as a waist buckle? Why not in the hair? So it's really how we interpret and how we wear the pieces. And I think it's always good to look at how they were originally made, why they were made, and how they were worn in the 20s, in the 30s, in the 18th century, in the 1960s, and then interpret that and wear them today. But I think they have to be worn. But the answer is yes, they have stood the test of time. Thank you.
And the next question, why are JAR pieces so sought after in the high value auctions market?
JAR pieces, I actually think that, again, wonderful pieces, wonderful creations. The thing about JAR pieces, you can't just go and buy them. You can't just choose a piece of JAR. You would go to his shop, his gallery, and it's probably a great privilege to actually have and own a piece of JAR. They are wonderful creations, little works of art. And again, a very, very limited supply. There's not a huge quantity on the market. And they are very much unique creations. So it's not, you can't just turn up and I'm going to buy a pair of JAR earrings. You can't do that. So I think that's one of the reasons why they are so unique. And I think they will stand. His creations will stand the test of time. If I think that answers that question.
And then, do you have a favourite from the ones you selected today?
Well, they're all my favourite, really, and I think it would be unfair to pick out any single item, because I think I mean, actually, but it was a struggle to actually narrow it down to just the 5. But I would say that I like all 5 of them. So I like the bandeau, I like the Ravasco earrings, I love the Tiffany, I love the Grima, I love the 18th century. So I like them all for their own merits. So I'm not going to have a favourite.
Okay, and this final question is sort of linked to that in a way. Do different periods of jewellery go in and out of fashion, like furniture?
They do, and I would say very much so. It's very much wearability is so important today. I think we're going through a phase of a Deco revival. Everybody loves 1920s, 1930s. To a degree, Edwardian. I'm sure it's got an influence by things such as Downton Abbey. I'm sure that's had an effect. There was a series on the television some years ago called Broadwalk Empire, which was really fabulous for the costume and the recreation of the period costume. So I think it's very much the popular culture, what's on at the television, what's on at the cinema. I know that when they did the remake of The Great Gatsby, there was a huge fashion of 20s clothes globally at that time. So that has an influence, but there's also its wearability, and a lot of the deco pieces are very wearable. I would say in terms of jewels that are probably a little bit out of fashion are the ones that are harder to wear, and invariably that means the sort of much heavier Victorian pieces. There are Victorian jewels out there that are very wearable today, pieces with intaglios and cameos and wonderful pieces that are very on point today, but there also are pieces that are less wearable and just don't fit in with modern taste and fashion. So I would say your brown furniture of the jewelry world is probably some element of Victorian jewelry, but not all of it. But it's all about wearability, and that's the most important thing to ask yourself. Can you wear it? Would you wear it? And if the answer is yes, then it's very much in fashion.
Brilliant. And actually, sorry, one other question. What changes or trends do you see in the pieces exhibited at this year's masterpiece as opposed to previous years, if any?
Well, I suppose the obvious one is the virtual. And obviously we'd love to get back to Masterpiece 2021. So I think it's for all of us, it's been a sharp learning curve. But I think it's been for everybody. But obviously, what I think one thing that we have experienced is obviously we've become much more adept at online and Zoom and Teams and all these other sort of virtual exhibition rooms. So I think this is something that will always be with us, and I think we'll probably see into the future. All of a sudden, we've sort of woken up and we realize we've got this amazing technology, and we need to use it more. And I think that's what we will see. And as a result, I think we're going to become much more international, much more global, so we can appeal globally much more easily now. So I think we've got this wonderful technology, and I think that's not just going to disappear when the virus disappears. I think it's here to stay. All this wonderful new technology. Enjoyed it immensely, and I just hope that we can go back for real next year, so we can actually look firsthand at the wonderful objects. But it was a great pleasure to talk through and give a virtual tour of the exhibition.